The British South Africa Company's administration of what became Rhodesia was chartered in 1889 by Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, and began with the pioneer column's march northeast to Mashonaland in 1890. Empowered by its charter to acquire, govern and develop the area north of the Transvaal in southern Africa, the company, headed by Cecil Rhodes, raised its own armed forces and carved out a huge block of territory through treaties, concessions and occasional military action, most prominently overcoming the Matabele army in the First and Second Matabele Wars of the 1890s. By the turn of the century, Rhodes's company held a vast, landlocked country, bisected by the Zambezi River. It officially named this land Rhodesia in 1895, and ran it until the early 1920s. The area south of the Zambezi became Southern Rhodesia, while that to the north became Northwestern and Northeastern Rhodesia, which were joined in 1911 to form Northern Rhodesia. Each territory was administered separately, with an administrator heading each territorial legislature. In Southern Rhodesia, which attracted the most white immigrants and developed fastest, a legislative council was established in 1898. This comprised a blend of company-nominated officials and elected members, with the numbers of each fluctuating over time, partially motivated by Rhodes's dream of a Cape to Cairo railway. Railway and telegraph lines were laid across previously barren Rhodesia with great speed, linking South Africa to the Belgian Congo's southern Katanga province by 1910. The British South Africa Police, responsible for law enforcement in southern Rhodesia, was established in 1896. A number of police forces north of the river amalgamated to form the Northern Rhodesia Police in 1911. Northern and Southern Rhodesians fought alongside the British in the Second Boer War and the First World War. About 40% of Southern Rhodesian white men fought in the latter, mostly on the Western Front in Europe. Black soldiers served in East Africa with the Rhodesia Native Regiment. As the number of elected members in the Legislative Council rose, power in southern Rhodesia gradually transferred from complete company rule to effective self-government by the growing number of white settlers. In a 1922 referendum, southern Rhodesians chose responsible government within the British Empire over incorporation into the Union of South Africa. The company's charter was duly revoked by Whitehall in 1923, and southern Rhodesia became a self-governing colony of Britain in October that year. Northern Rhodesia became a directly run British protectorate in April 1924. Origins: Rhodes's dream amid the scramble for Africa during the 1880s. The South African-based businessman and politician Cecil Rhodes envisioned the annexation to the British Empire of a block of territory connecting the Cape of Good Hope and Cairo, respectively, at the southern and northern tips of Africa, and the concurrent construction of a line of rail linking the two. On geopolitical maps, British territories were generally marked in red or pink, so this concept became known as the Cape to Cairo Red Line. In the immediate vicinity of the Cape, this ambition was challenged by the presence of independent states to the northeast of Britain's Cape Colony. There were several Boer republics, and to the north of these was the Kingdom of Matabeleland, ruled by Lobengula, having secured the Rudd concession on mining rights from a Lobengula in October 1888. Rhodes and his British South Africa Company were granted a royal charter by Queen Victoria in October 1889. The company was empowered under this charter to trade with local rulers, form banks, own and manage land, and raise and run a police force. In return for these rights, the company would govern and develop any territory it acquired, while respecting laws enacted by extant African rulers, and upholding free trade within its borders. North to the Zambezi territorial rivalry with Portugal, the projected company's sphere was initially Matabeleland and its immediate neighbors between the Limpopo River and the Zambezi. Portugal's colonies in Angola and Mozambique, coastal territories respectively to the west and east of this general area, were over 3 centuries old, and Lisbon's alliance with Britain formally dated back to the 1386 Treaty of Windsor. However, the exceedingly lethargic pace of local Portuguese colonization and development was such that even in the 1880s, Portugal's dominions in Mozambique comprised only a few scattered ports, harbors and plantations, all of which were administered from the island of Mozambique just north of the Mozambique Channel. Angola differed little, with gigantic tracts of hinterland coming under the largely nominal purview of Portugal's modest colony on the coast. Rhodes quietly planned to annex some of Mozambique into the company domain so he could establish a major port at the mouth of the Pungwe River. He thought this might make an ideal sea outlet for his proposed settlement in Mashonaland, the area directly to Matabeleland's northeast where Lobengula held dominion over many Mashona chiefs. Rhodes believed that the Portuguese claim to Mozambique was tenuous enough that he could win much of it without provoking major ire. The occupation of the Portuguese even along the coastline is in most places merely a paper one, he wrote to Whitehall in late 1889, and if this has not been recognized by international agreement, I think it might be left open. But contrary to Rhodes's opinion, general consensus at the Berlin Conference of 1884–85 had made Portugal's hold over the Mozambican coastline very secure. The Portuguese had expanded inland during the late 1880s, creating Manicaland in the eastern Mashona country. They founded Beira, a port on Rhodes's proposed Pungwe site, in 1890. Portugal issued the so-called Pink Map around this time, laying claim to the very corridor of land between Angola and Mozambique that Rhodes desired. The British government issued a firm ultimatum against the Portuguese claims in January 1890. Lisbon swiftly acquiesced and left the area open for the company's drive north. Territorial expansion and consolidation. Pioneer Column. The Pioneer Column, initially comprising about 100 volunteers referred to as pioneers, was raised by the company during 1890. Led by Major Frank Johnson, a 23-year-old adventurer, the column was designed by the company to be the instrument by which it would not only acquire Mashonaland, but also begin its development. Men from a wide variety of backgrounds therefore filled its ranks. According to one member, prospectors predominate, but nearly every trade and profession under the sun is represented. One troop is called the Gentlemanly Troop because the majority in it are brokers. Most of the pioneers self-identified as South African rather than British, and many of them were Afrikaners. At Rhodes's insistence, several sons of the Cape Colony's leading families were also included. Each pioneer was promised 3,000 acres of land and 15 mining claims in return for his service. Lobengula gave his approval to the ostensibly non-military expedition, but many of his Isanduna were fiercely against it, seeing it as an appropriation of Matabele territory. Wary that one or more of these Isanduna might turn rogue and attack the pioneers, the company gradually enlarged the escorting detachment of British South Africa Company's police until it numbered 500 men. headed by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Pennyfather, an officer seconded from the British Army. To Johnson's chagrin, the Imperial officer was also given ultimate command of the column. The column was to move roughly east from Mashonaland, a small camp near the border of Matabele and Mashonaland, and then march north to its destination. It would build a road as it went, founding minor forts along the way, and establish a major town in Mashonaland, whereupon the pioneers would be released to farm, prospect and trade. Frederick Sellos, a famed hunter with intimate knowledge of Mashonaland, was made the column's intelligence officer. He chose as its intended destination an open patch of veld he had discovered during his travels, which he called Mount Hampton. The proposed site was about 650 kilometers to the northeast of Mashonaland. The column departed on the 28th of June 1890, and on the 11th of July crossed the Tule River into Matabeleland. Its first settlement, Fort Tule, was inaugurated near the river bank. Though Johnson was nominally in command of the pioneers, he was generally seen as untried and green when contrasted with the experienced, respected authority of Sellos. According to most contemporary accounts, Sellos was effectively in control. The officers were outwardly harmonious, but Johnson was privately troubled by pangs of jealousy. The column was initially accompanied by about 200 Guato provided by the Swana chief Kama, who had firmly aligned his country with Britain. The Guato provided much assistance in building the new road, but animosity soon developed between them and the whites, principally because the latter were not used to treating blacks as equals. By mutual consent, the Guato returned home. As the column continued its march north, Sellos split off with a small section and headed east to challenge the Portuguese in Manicaland. Pennyfather and Johnson continued at the head of the main force and founded Fort Victoria, Fort Charter, and, on the 12th of September, Fort Salisbury. The site of Salisbury was a naturally flat and marshy meadow, bounded by a rough coppice. The pioneers were about 15 kilometers short of Mount Hampton, but Pennyfather climbed the coppice, surveyed the open veldt and insisted that it was magnificent, so they need go no further. He reported back to Rhodes in triumphant tones. Site selected. ... All well. Magnificent country. Natives pleased to see us. On the morning of the 13th of September 1890, about 10 o'clock, the officers and men of the pioneer column paraded atop the coppice before an improvised flagstaff, with the column standing to attention. Lieutenant Edward Tyndale Biscoe hoisted the Union Jack. A 21-gun salute was fired, and 3 cheers were given for the Queen. Work then began on the fort, which was completed by the end of September. The pioneer column was then disbanded. Eastern skirmishes with Portugal. Instructed by Rhodes to hurry east, Sellos met with the Manica chief, Mount Asa, on the 14th of September 1890, and agreed with him a concession whereby Mount Asa promised not to ally with any other foreign power, and granted the company exclusive rights to mine within his territory, as well as to build railways, bridges, canals and other projects typical of colonial settlement. In return, the company gave Mount Asa rifles and other equipment, and a promise of protection against attacks by the Portuguese of the neighboring Shangaan people. Portugal dispatched a small force to militarily overwhelm Mount Asa and reclaim the area in early November 1890. Captain Patrick Forbes rode to Mount Asa's aid from Salisbury, quickly routed the Portuguese, and thereupon advanced all the way to Barra, securing further concessions from local chiefs along the way to build a railroad. Tense negotiations between Britain and Portugal followed, finally concluding with a treaty signed in Lisbon on the 11th of June 1891. Prominent among the numerous territorial revisions concessions was the integration of Mangwanani into the company domain as part of Mashonaland. Britain concurrently recognized Portugal's authority over the entire Mozambican coast, putting an end to Rhodes's designs for a company port on the Mozambique Channel. North to Katanga, representatives of the company crossed the Zambezi to venture even further north, the Shire Highlands of Nyasaland, far to the northeast on the banks of Lake Nyasa, had been settled by a modest number of British missionaries for about a decade, and in Barrowsland, to the northwest, King Louis Nika hosted Francois Coillard of the Paris Evangelical Missionary Society. Rhodes sent Elliot Lochner north to negotiate with Louis Nika in late 1889, and in June 1890 the king signed the Lochner concession, which gave the company rights to mine, trade and build railways in Barrowsland in return for British protection over his domain from external threats, and a British resident in Levendika's court at Lilongwe. The British government thereupon chartered the company to defend Barrowsland, as well as all country to the east as far as Nyasaland, and to the north as far as Lake Tanganyika and Katanga, a country where resources were scarce and tropical disease was rampant. Barrowsland offered comparatively few economic opportunities for the company and little incentive for white immigration. The main objective of Lochner's expedition was all along to clear a path towards Katanga, a mineral-rich area further north, where Msiai ruled the Yaqui Kingdom. Katanga was also coveted by the owner of the Congo Free State, King Leopold II of the Belgians, whose representatives Rhodes hoped to beat there. "I want you to get Mosiris," Rhodes told one of his agents, Joseph Thompson. "I mean Katanga. You must go and get Katanga." The efforts of Thompson and Alfred Sharp to secure a company concession over the area were furiously rebuffed by Msiai in late 1890, and ultimately foiled by the 1891–92 Stairs expedition, a multinational force in Leopold's service, led by Canadian-British Army officer, Captain William Grant Stairs, which violently clashed with the obstreperous Msiai, and eventually shot him dead when an attempt to arrest him turned into a firefight. Msiai had been in the habit of displaying the heads of his enemies atop poles outside his boma, and the expedition's men hoisted his own head alongside them in an attempt to strike fear into the locals. The country promptly capitulated to the Free State, ending the company's expansion north. The company did little to fulfill Britain's obligations to Levendika, having failed in Katanga. Its hierarchy saw Barrowsland as an unworkable inconvenience that might later be exchanged with Portugal. Whitehall, by contrast, regarded Levendika's domain as an important buffer against further Portuguese claims inland. Neither the company nor the British government proved eager to take practical responsibility for the Barrows. In 1894, while informing Britain of his willingness to administer on Whitehall's behalf north of the Zambezi, Rhodes stressed that he would not take Barrowsland. The promised British resident at Lilongwe remained conspicuously absent despite Levendika's repeated inquiries, until the appointment by Rhodes of Robert Thorne Correndon in 1897. Matabele was the first shimmering, though the company made good on most of the pledges it had made to local leaders in Matabeleland. The ascent of Lobengula and other less prominent figures, particularly regarding mining rights, was often evaded, misrepresented or simply ignored. Company officials also demanded that Lobengula cease the habitual raids on Mashona villages by Matabele MPs, enraged by what he perceived as slights against his authority. Lobengula made war on Mashonaland in 1893. Matabele warriors began the wholesale slaughter of Mashonas near Fort Victoria in July that year. The company organized an indaba to try to end the conflict, but this failed. The First Matabele War had begun. The company moved on Lobengula during October and early November 1893, and used the inexorable firepower of its Maxim machine guns to crush attacks by the far larger Matabele army as it rode southwest. As the whites approached his royal town at Bulawayo, Lobengula fled, torching it as he went. Company troops were dispatched to bring him back, and the resultant pursuit north ended with the ambush and annihilation of the 34-man Shangani patrol by the remnants of Lobengula's army on 4 December 1893. The king died from smallpox while on his way north in January 1894, and his Izinduna made peace with the company soon after. Bulawayo was rebuilt as a company-run city atop the ruins of the former Matabele capital. Rhodes subsequently funded education for 3 of Lobengula's sons. The Matabele rose again in 1896 at the behest of Mlimo, a spiritualist leader who was revered as a god by much of the local populace. The botched Jameson raid on the Transvaal at the end of 1895 had severely depleted the company's garrison in Matabeleland, and the settlers in Bulawayo had little to defend themselves with. Mlimo convinced his followers that the white man was responsible for all their ills: hot tax, forced work, locusts, rinderpest, drought and so on, and that he and other tribal prophets could ensure the success of a massed rebellion by turning the settlers' bullets into water. This uprising, called the Second Matabele War of the First Chimurenga, began in March 1896. Over the following 3 months the Matabele killed hundreds of isolated settlers and the families, but Bulawayo itself held out. When the company mustered reinforcements from South Africa, the Matabele retreated into the Matapos Hills. Here Frederick Russell Burnham, an American scout long in company service, discovered and killed Mlimo in June 1896. Starting in August 1896, Rhodes personally played a key role in ending the Matabele insurgency, with one of the widows of Malikazi acting as a go-between. The company and the rebel Izinduna arranged in Indaba for the 21st of August. The Izinduna agreed to meet Rhodes and 3 companions in the Matapos Hills. At this meeting, the insurgents vehemently protested against the prior treatment under company rule, prompting Rhodes to walk away from the other whites and to sit among the Matabele instead, apparently intending to symbolically demonstrate empathy and a spirit of reconciliation. He told the Matabele that he was on the side, and that he would personally ensure the non-recurrence of any abuses. The Izinduna would be fully restored to the status they had held under Lobengula, he said, and there would be no retribution against those who had taken part in the Chimurenga. After 4 hours, it was agreed to continue the talks. Bitterness endured among some of the rebels, but 3 further Indabas progressed well, and the Matabele rising ended amicably in October 1896. Around the same time, Mashonaland, most prominently Makwati, Kaguvi and Nihandanaikashakana, instigated their own Chimurenga in Mashonaland. The company forcibly put down this uprising during 1897, and afterwards took significant steps to demilitarize the tribal population and improve relations with the local chiefs. Small pockets of Mashona unrest continued sporadically until 1903, but peace endured in Matabeleland, including both theaters. The Chimurenga has been estimated to have taken around 8,450 lives, roughly 8,000 blacks died, and about 450 whites, of whom 372 were locally based settlers. The rest were soldiers in company or British service from outside Rhodesia. Administration. The name Rhodesia, the company initially referred to each territory it acquired by its respective name, Mashonaland, Matabele and so on, but there was no official term for them collectively. Rhodes preferred the name Zambezi, while Leander Starr Jameson proposed Charterland. Many of the first settlers instead called the new home Rhodesia, after Rhodes. This was common enough usage by 1891 for it to be used in newspapers. In 1892 it was used in the name of Salisbury's first newspaper, the Rhodesia Herald. The company officially adopted the name Rhodesia in 1895, and 3 years later the UK government followed suit. It is not clear why the name should have been pronounced with the emphasis on the second rather than the first syllable. The historian Robert Blake comments, but this appears to have been the custom from the beginning and it never changed. Administrative divisions and centres. Matabeland and Mashonaland, both of which lay south of the Zambezi, were officially referred to collectively as Southern Rhodesia from 1898, and formally united under that name in 1901. Meanwhile, the areas to the rivers north became northwestern and northeastern Rhodesia, which were governed separately, and amalgamated in 1911 to form northern Rhodesia. The overall centre of company administration was Salisbury, which was also the southern Rhodesian capital. The administrative centre in northeastern Rhodesia was Fort Jameson, while in northwestern Rhodesia the capital was Kalomo initially, and Livingstone from 1907. Livingstone became the capital of northern Rhodesia when the two northern territories joined in 1911, and remained so at the end of company rule. Administrative posts. Politics and legislature. The head of government in each territory under company rule was in effect a regional administrator appointed by the company. In southern Rhodesia, a 10-man legislative council first sat in 1899, originally made up of the administrator himself, 5 other members nominated by the company, and 4 elected by registered voters. The number of elected members rose gradually under company rule until they numbered 13 in 1920, sitting alongside the administrator and 6 other company officials in the 20-member Legislative Council. The company's royal charter was originally due to run out in October 1914, but it was renewed for a further 10 years in 1915. In northern Rhodesia, administration was entirely undertaken by the company until 1917, when an advisory council was introduced, comprising 5 elected members. This council did little to lighten the company's administrative burden north of the river, but endured until the end of company rule.